I did too. Yeah, I was, yeah. Just saw Dr. McFadden with us. Good afternoon, everybody. It's 2:00. We're going to get started on time. I've been told that we do not have to call roll. We have most of us here in person. But just in case, I'm going to go around the room, let everybody introduce themselves. If they don't know, I see Representative Tipton is on. You look good on the screen, sir. You look wonderful.
Well, thank you, President Thompson. It's good to be here. I'm actually at the school superintendent's conference. I was on a panel discussion, so I'm transitioning from secondary to post-secondary.
Well, that transition is easier for some than others. We'll talk about that during the session, all right? Secretary Hicks should be online fairly soon.
Oh, he's on.
He's on. I'll tell you what, let's just go ahead and start. Senator Gibbons, let's introduce herself. I think we all know each other, just but for the audience who may not, I think they know us too. Let's start with you.
Sir David Gibbons, 9th Senate District, honored and proud to be here. Enjoyed the chance to be on campus. Started in 1909 and found this, as I do all of your campuses. I marvel at the opportunity that each of you have in leading your institutions to get to be among your young people and the futures that look so bright and excitement and energy, especially on a fall day when it's so nice outside. Thank you for the leadership that each of you bring. Thank you.
I'm Katie Short-Thompson, president of NKU.
And maybe well, I don't know. I guess you may be as I think about it, but the latest of the edition.
Yep.
Jay Morgan, president of Morehead State University.
Kim Shasta, president of University.
Eli Caputo, University of Kentucky.
Bob Jackson, president of Murray State University. Tim Caboni, president of Western Kentucky University.
Good.
Ryan Quarles, case at TCS.
And Gary Thompson, president of CPD.
They do make that president of Eastern Kentucky University.
And the folks online, we'll start with you, Secretary Hicks. How are you?
Hey, good afternoon. John Hicks, Secretary of the Governor's Executive Cabinet.
And Representative Tipton, Chair Tipton.
Yes, Representative James Tipton, House District 53, representing the Speaker today.
Thank you all. We'll just jump into it and get started. Let me give you the parameters by which we're called to this. As you all know, we were asked by the General Assembly to come back and this time around, basically focusing only on two things. One is the redefinition. We had URM before, but now we are asked by law to look at and define underrepresented. And that URM category made up 3% of the performance funding model. If you want to get down to the nitty gritty, what that 3% means, that's why we have Bill and Travis here. We had a stop gap placement this last time. One half of that percent was covered by low income, which took us to 9.5% last year, or in this year, grant, sorry. And then 1.5% was defined by first generation. So we're here to look at that 3%. That's the one piece. Second piece is that at 3% last time we had 1-to-1 weights, no differential in weights. We have to make that decision this time out also. That's all we're called to do. The agenda does not call for anything else along those lines. So we are pretty well stuck in that agenda. And that's what we're here to discuss. I have at the table Bill Payne, who is our Chief Financial Officer, as you all know, and then Travis Motsi, who is our Chief Technology Officer. But before we call on them, are there any questions or clarifications that we can have? We appreciate those in the audience. Let's say that too. Welcome. Dr. Short Thompson, thank you for hosting us at this wonderful institution. Any questions or clarifications before we get started? Bill, I'm just going to jump into it and turn it over to you, sir.
Well, while folks were out of the room, Heather Feasy passed out some information that should be at your places. It includes an agenda for this afternoon's meeting, a packet of 5 tables that shows several different scenarios. The first scenario comparing low income at 1.5%, first generation at 1.5%, a hypothetical URM at 3% distribution, and I'll explain that in a minute. And then the next 4 tables compare metrics that are under consideration with the actual 2024-25 distribution. And then you should have 2 pieces of paper. One contains about 4 tables showing the overlap between URM student baccalaureate degrees and the metrics under consideration, which are low income, first generation college students under prepared degrees, and then a high need high school metric. Travis Johnson is going to help us out when we get to that point to tell us what's in those tables and help folks understand that. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and get started. And Heather,
Let me add one other thing before we get started. For the end of today, these are metrics we're looking at based on what we heard from you all. CPE approved, as you all know, the low performing schools in there. So at the end of the day, you may have some more for us to run the next time. Our hope is that we can sooner or later, but hopefully a lot sooner, get to where we need to be, that we don't have any of these meetings to get us.
as President Thompson indicated, we're here today to try to determine how to define an underrepresented student metric to replace the underrepresented minority metric. Here's what we're going to be going over. A little bit of background information first. What were the work recommendations from 2023? What was the mechanism by which the URM metric was moved? What were the replacement metrics? What was the impact of that on the distribution? What is the working group's charge? And then we have 4 potential metrics that I just mentioned a moment ago that are all bachelor's degree metrics. And then lastly, we'll get to the major decision points that this group will have to decide, if not this meeting, in subsequent meetings. So in terms of the background information, we want to cover what were the changes to the university funding model that were recommended by the working group from 2023. How was the URM bachelor's degree metric removed from the model? What metrics were used to replace the URM bachelor's degree metric in 2024? And how were those metrics determined? And then what was the impact, financial impact of that change? So here are the 5 changes that were recommended by the 2023 working group in terms of the university funding model. Was increase the premium for low-income student bachelor's degrees, add a new adult learner metric, eliminate the degree efficiency index that was used to weight bachelor's degrees, modify the small school adjustments at KSU and Moorhead to try to allow them to more fully compete in the model. And then we adjusted the non-resident credit hour weighting from 50% to 75%. So here's how the URM metric was removed, and I think most folks around the table know this. But Senate Bill 91 either included some new language or struck through some existing language to remove the URM metric. In Section 2D, the Senate Bill 191 struck the word minority, and that leaves underrepresented students in that list of other underserved populations, and that's what we're here to define as a group. It also said that the funding model shall include a public university sector formula and a KCTCS sector formula, and shall not include any race-based metrics or target in those formulas. President Thompson asked me to include a couple of slides to show the progress that we've made Since performance funding was implemented in terms of growth in URN degrees produced, and that's readily evident in the chart to the left. As you can see, the number of bachelor's degrees awarded to URN students increased 7 out of the last 9 years. And it's a pretty significant upward trajectory. The chart on the right shows that over the past 9 years, URN bachelor's degrees were the fastest growing degree type. Total bachelor's degrees, and I keep reading that from here, so I'm going to refer to my notes. Total bachelor's degrees increased by 3.4% between 2014 and 2023. STEM plus H bachelor's degrees by 25.7%. URN bachelor's degrees by 45.5%, which is phenomenal growth. And then low income bachelor's degrees actually decreased by almost 7%, which is one reason the 2023 working group increased the weighting for that low income metric from 3% to 8%.
I want to add parenthetically here, the reason why those were in it from the beginning, because those are the biggest gaps that we have in this document. They're URMs were way far behind the other population groups. So with low income, we know we had to produce more STEM H degrees, as you may remember, for the state to move forward in this economic development. So those were all items that were designed to help close some gaps.
And on cue, here are a couple of charts that show what has happened in terms of the gap between the URM and low income retention rates and overall retention rates, and then also graduation rates on the right. As you can see, that gap was closed to 2.8 percentage points in 2020 in terms of retention rate. And that was the narrowest in terms of that gap between the overall retention rate and URM retention rates. And then after 2020, you can see a couple of years where that gap widened back out. You will see an upward trajectory between 2021 and 2023, which is positive. But that gap did widen out compared to 2020. So we still have work to do in that regard. The chart on the right shows graduation rates. The overall is the blue line, the URM is the orange line, and the low income graduation rate is the green line. And you can see that between 2017 and 2021, Kentucky universities closed the gap between URM and overall graduation rates from 13.5 to 9.9 respectively.
Which one of the largest in the nation?
Yeah, which was a fantastic improvement. But then following COVID, you can see that we've had a couple of years where that gap has widened back out. So I guess the main takeaway for me from this is that there are still gaps, there's still work to do. And even though the URM metric had been removed from the funding model, we really encourage university administrators and KCTCS administrators to continue to focus on that target population because we've made some great progress to this point. Anything else you want to add right now, President Thompson?
Well, just if we have gaps in any of our places, we can't forget them, right? We may not be able to use the metric anymore, but I think it is important for us to move Kentucky forward that we give everybody an opportunity to have a degree or credential that matters so we are part of the sustainable economy.
President Thompson already mentioned the replacement metrics, and again, that was affected by Senate Bill 191 in Section 4. It said the Council on Post-Secondary Education for the fiscal year 2024-25 funding distribution in the comprehensive funding model shall define underrepresented students as first-generation college students and shall distribute 1.5% of allocable resources to bachelor's degree production in that area. And then they added 1.5%, as President Thompson said, to the 8% for low income. And it goes on to say that the council will distribute 9.5% of allocable resources to low income students in the university model. I was not part of a call, but it's my understanding there was a conference call late during the session, and the stakeholders agreed that 1.5% for first generation and 1.5% for low income would be added to the model on an unweighted basis. And as President Thompson said, it would be a 1-to-1 weighting in terms of that sector weight. Okay, so I want to talk about the impact of removing the URM metric on the distribution for 2024-25. And to do that, if you look at that table to the right, that first column of numbers is a hypothetical distribution that retains the URM metric consistent with the original work group recommendations. That next column that's highlighted in yellow is the actual performance distribution for fiscal year 2024-25, which replaced the URM bachelor's degree metric with unweighted low income and first generation college student bachelor's degree metrics. Look at that fourth column. It's the same two metrics, low income at 1.5, first generation at 1.5. But in this case, the sector weighting is calculated and applied.
What was the weighting for the two variables?
I don't have it right in front of me, but I can share that information with you and with the rest of the group. I've shared it with your CBOs, but it was calculated the way all of the original weighting calculated to achieve equilibrium between the two sectors in the first year that particular metric would be implemented.
Okay.
So basically, it's designed so that the first time you run the model with that new weighting or that new metric, no funding would shift from the research sector to the comprehensive sector. No funding would shift from the comprehensive sector to the research sector. And if you look at the bullet points compared to the distribution where the URM metric is retained, allocating both of those new metrics on an unweighted basis shifted a little over $4 million from the research sector to the comprehensive institutions. If those weights had been applied, only $304,000 would have shifted from the research sector to the comprehensive sector. So about 92% of that shift was not due to a change in outcomes or performance. It was not due to a change in the metrics. It was simply due to doing away with the weighting between the two sectors. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Dr. Payne, this is Representative Tipton. One question I have, and one of the challenges we talked about is what was the challenge in evaluating first generation college students?
What was the challenge in evaluating first generation?
Were there challenges in being able to identify accurately what those differences in metrics were?
Well, Representative Tipton, it really was a data limitation on how we can make it with data that we had so that we can make it the same across institutions. So basically what we did is we used our student financial aid collection file, which is primarily based on the FAFSA. And then we took variables from the FAFSA that asked for then, and it's changed now, the mother and father's education level. And basically we created a logic from that. So that was really the only way we could, I guess, standardize it across institution based on our own data, our own data available.
Yeah, and the point it gets to, as you all know, I stated clearly I thought it was a squishy metric. So I'll say it again. Simply, not everybody fills out FAFSA. Not everybody, I mean, and reporting, not that many things are not self-reported. It's not as clean and as enumerated, if you will, as some of the other metrics. Even though not all are clean and enumerated by the means all the time. So that was part of what were the issues I think we raised. It was a data limitation.
Any other questions? Comment?
Can you go back one more slide again? Can you just go through the 92% of the shift not due to change in outcomes or metrics? Just one
Sorry.
The last bullet says about 92% of the shift not due to change in outcomes or metrics. Can you just explain that bullet one more time?
Yeah, if you look at the two scenarios, one is the actual that's highlighted in yellow, that does not apply a sector weighting between sectors. The two columns to the right, the sector weighting is applied. And then you look at the differential between the 4.01 million that shifted when there was no sector weighting. And then when the weighting is applied, only $304,000 shifted. So 92% of that shift in funding was due just to the doing away with the sector weighting.
If you look at the far right column, that's purely a differential in dollars based on performance.
Okay.
In other words, in all of these scenarios, if you look at the bottom of the URM at 3% distribution column, the total is 81.9 million. If you look at the bottom of the column highlighted in yellow, it's 81.9 million. If you look at the bottom of the fourth column, 81.9 million. So the appropriations were kept the same. The data for all the other metrics were kept the same. In comparing these two scenarios, it was two of the same metrics, low income at 1.5%, first gen at 1.5%. The only thing that changed was, in the two middle columns, there's no sector weighting. And in the two columns to the far right, there is a sector weighting. And so that's how we're able to determine that most of that shift was not due to anything that was data or outcomes related. It was just doing away with that sector weighting.
Secretary Hicks, did I see you raise your hand?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Thompson. Bill, just if you wouldn't mind remind the group briefly what the weighting differences are.
You mean the sector weightings? I'm going to assume so. Well, there were three main reasons why and how those sector weightings came about. First of all, there are cost differences and mission differences between research.
I'm sorry, Bill. I'm not asking for the explanation. I'm asking for the metrics. What's the value of the weighting?
I don't have those in front of me right this minute, but there's a little bit over 2, 2.3, 2.3. They differ depending on which metric you're looking at.
So I guess to that end, Bill, in the 92%, were you calculating that based on what the URM premium was, which was a 1.2, or was it calculated on the low income, which was a 2.3?
It's calculated on the low income and the first generation weights.
We don't know what that weighting. What was the first gen just same as low income?
No, low income would have one weighting and first gen would have a different weighting.
But do we know what the first gen? We know what the low income is, but we know what the first gen weighting was.
Yeah, it was calculated in the same way that all of the original weightings were calculated back.
But we didn't have the first gen weighting in the original calculation.
No, but we used the same methodology to calculate the weighting this time around. In other words, we looked at how many first generation degrees were produced by the research sector and what does the 3% allocation of allocable resources, what is that dollar amount for the research sector, and you divide the number of degrees into that amount of funding. You do the same thing for the comprehensive sector, and then you calculate that differential between the research sector and the comprehensive sector to achieve equilibrium in that metric.
The disclosure of the weighting, sir.
So I have a question. So the sector weighting, and then there are also metrics that advantage sectors. Is that the case? So if you go back a screen and talks about type of institution, maybe it's a couple of screens. Well, maybe it's a lot of screens. Those last two, those have to do with sectors, right? The small school, right? So you have those sector adjustments and then additional.
The small school adjustment does not require weighting because it's back out of the allocable resources before you run the funding model. So those are dollars that you essentially take off the table for every institution, but we increased the small school adjustment for KSU and Morehead State University in 2024-25. Those are dollars that you take out of the allocable resources for those institutions, and it stays in the base funding for those institutions, but it's not considered in terms of when you actually run the performance funding.
So how are those performance funding related? What do they have to do with performance?
what does the small school adjustment have to do with
Yeah.
performance? It doesn't have anything to do with performance per se, but it's a recognition that our smaller institutions have, a certain level of fixed costs that they have to cover in terms of their operating budgets. And we provided those small school adjustments to try to compensate for that. It's a way to compensate for size across institutions. If you've got research one institutions that are fairly large, Eastern and Western are fairly large compared to Moorhead and KSU. And so that used to be a 10% weighting, a 10% small school adjustment across all the comprehensives. But 2024-25, as part of that working group recommendation, we raised that small school adjustment for Moorhead and KSU, and actually 24-25 was the first time that Moorhead has actually received a distribution, albeit only a couple of $100,000. It's the first time they actually received a distribution from the performance funding model instead of having $1 million plus home promise allocation. And I know you probably don't know what home promise allocation means, but anyway, raising those small school adjustments for those two institutions was to try to get them to funding parity with the other institutions so that as more dollars were put into the pool was increased from 97 million to 105 million in 24-25. It's going to increase to 115 million next year. That's increasing those small school adjustments was intended to help Moorhead and KSU actually begin to earn some funding through the performance fund.
Was the final one to recognize the large schools?
The waiting for the waiting for non-resident credit hours earned. The working group back in 2016 counted in-state credit hours earned at a 1.0 weighting. They counted non-resident credit hours earned at 0.5. So non-resident credit hours were only weighted at half that of in-state credit hours. That was increased to 0.75 for 2024-25 to better align the distributions in the funding model with the council's tuition fee policy, which is trying to encourage more out-of-state enrollment, provided no in-state students are displaced by out-of-state students. And so we wanted the funding model and the council's non-resident student tuition and fee policy to be aligned with one another. In other words, we're trying to maintain enrollment at our institutions by targeting non-resident students.
Well, let me add to that. Since you're so close to Ohio, we did this in Ohio. If we did not have anything for small school, Central State, County State, Belmont would have the same. So it's not a major school. I can triple the size of Kentucky State, which I plan to do. I will still not get it. Doesn't mean that we've been lazy. I will work. Like the manual as it is designed, it's voluntary.
Okay, moving on, the working group's charge was determined by the General Assembly in Senate Bill 191. In section 3 of that bill, it indicates that the post-secondary education working group shall convene during the 2024 interim for the sole purpose of considering how to define underrepresented students in the comprehensive funding model. And it went on to specify that by December 1st of this year, the working group will report to the governor and the Legislative Research Commission concerning our recommendations. So that's the charge of this working group. And now we're going to get into some of the potential metrics. As President Thompson indicated, he got some feedback from some of our campus officials, and the 4 metrics that we have put on the table for initial consideration are low-income student bachelor's degrees, first-generation student bachelor's degrees, underprepared student bachelor's degrees, and high-need high school student bachelor's degrees. And 2 of our campuses, Moorhead State University and Murray State University, have proposed 2 additional metrics that we're still trying to work out the details on how to assign value to those. And his bachelor's degree is weighted by median family income, and we've actually got a call tomorrow with Mary Pfister to try to work out the details of that particular metric. And President Jackson, Jackie Dudley at Murray suggested that dual credit hours should be added to the credit hour metrics. And start, because right now, dual credit hours are not counted in the funding model.
Bill, can you walk through how each of those four are operationalized, just so we know?
I will be happy to, and there it is.
All right.
So the definition of low-income student bachelor's degrees is the number of bachelor's degrees awarded to low-income students during the academic year. Low income is defined as a Pell recipient at any time since 2005 or 6 at the graduating institution. And that includes degrees conferred to residents, reciprocity, and non-resident low-income students. In terms of some of the rationale for that particular metric, including a low-income degree metric, provides financial incentives for institutions to enroll and actively support and graduate students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And research indicates that institutions tend to respond to those kinds of incentives by adopting strategies to improve graduation rates for that population. In terms of the potential impacts of that scenario, again, we're looking at, if we were to include a sector weighting, or if we were to not have a sector weighting or equal weighting. And in this case, in all of the four scenarios that we're going to be looking at, that first column that we're comparing it to is the actual 2024-25 distribution. Of course, the other two are hypothetical scenarios where the 3% URN bachelor's degree metric is replaced with a 3% low-income student bachelor's degree metric. So the impact, allocating 3% of resources to unweighted low-income bachelor's degrees, as you can see in the difference column right in the middle of the table, it shifts very little funding among institutions. Well, that is to be expected, because in the current year, 1.5% of that 3% was distributed based on low income, and there was no sector weighting. And so you would expect there to be very little shift in the funding. If you calculate and apply the sector weightings, it shifts 3.97 million from the comprehensive institutions to the research institutions, which by my calculations would restore about 99% of the 4.01 million that was given up by the research institutions in 2024-25 due to that lack of weighting. So are there any questions about that particular set of scenarios for the low-income student bachelor's degrees? President Labonte, here's your next definition.
Secretary Hicks, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Thompson. Bill, I would ask that of those four metrics that you got in the two slides before, will the low income item represent the largest number in terms of quantity of bachelor's degrees compared to the underprepared, the first timers, et cetera?
I'm going to defer to Travis Muncie on to that. I know it provides just about the highest proportion of overlap with the URN metric, the low income metric does.
I think he's asking per population that's in for schools. Is that our largest bracket? Is that what you're asking, Secretary Hicks?
Yeah, I'm just saying among the four that you offered up, does the low income metric reflect, I'll say, the highest volume of individuals meeting that test?
Well, based on the tables that I'm looking at, and Travis Muncie will go over these in a minute. If I look at the sector total 5-year average, and that's probably not an average in terms of total, it's 13,405 degrees for low income. Let's see. 8,921 for first generation, 12,000 793 for underprepared. And I don't know how to answer the question on this one. County high school. It would be the eligible column. 4,545.
So your answer is yes, sir.
Yes.
It's the largest.
The answer is yes. Thank you, President Thompson. You get right to the crux of that.
That was gonna be mine.
Anyway, back to the first generation bachelor's degree metric. The definition is the total number of bachelor's degrees awarded to first generation college students during the academic year. First generation is defined as a bachelor's degree graduate that reported on the FAFSA at any time during their enrollment at their graduating institution that both their mother's and father's educational level was below college or beyond, or one parent's educational level was reported as below college or beyond, and the other parent's education level is not reported. So that's the definition of the first generation metric. In terms of rationale, the first generation college students often face unique challenges due to lack of family experience navigating college, financial aid, or academic expectations, making them a group that can benefit significantly from targeted support. And in terms of additional.
Hold on, Bill. Representative Tipton, is your hand up?
Yes, thank you, President Thompson. And my question is kind of related to John's question. Is it accurate that a lot of the students who are in the low income category also cross over as first generation and underprepared? Were you able to do the data on that, on those students that kind of crossed over, that met all those metrics?
Yes, President. So I actually don't have that in front of me, but we do have those intersections. So we created those. So we can definitely provide that information. But we did go through, we mainly did the intersection with to look to see what each individual, how each individual metric, how it overlapped with URM baccalaureate receivers from our 22-23 file. But we can also get those other intersections.
To answer your question, though, without having those data, yes, they do. You know, we may not have exactly the numbers, but historically speaking, and I've been at this change in the last several months or a year, that is very much an overlap in cases. And many of those, a significant amount has also been first generation in the country as citizens, by the way. That's another overlap.
And Representative Tipton, out of all of these metrics, the one that captures the largest proportion of URM, low income, and first generation is the I-need high school metric. Looking at the data that Travis Muncie has put together, it addresses all three of those other metrics.
I understood there was a question about FAFSA completion for first gen students and verifying that. Isn't that the same concern for low income students?
Yes. So where we do define that as a Pell recipient, if a student did not fill out a FAFSA, they would not.
You know, across all the institutions, what our FAFSA completion rates are?
It is as a yes, it is as a sector. It is in the high 80s, low 90s. So the proportion of overall, it's a very high.
Yeah, because you have to remember it's those students that we currently have, right? It's not those students that we're trying to get that's not filling out. Right.
I just can't help but wonder, is there a relationship between completion of the FAFSA and then being more competitive for funding?
Yeah, I would imagine. You know,
That seems unfortunate.
yeah, no. Let's say
It's like, it's a mechanism, not a means, right?
If I couldn't hear the questions.
Said a lot.
I'll hear one. Let me turn this way.
Basically, if is it an advantage to have a, I guess, high proportion of FAFSA completers at your institution from a performance funding model perspective, given that both the low income metric And, some of the other metrics rely on the FAFSA being completed in order for a student to qualify. Which
I certainly think the data set would be more robust the more people fill out the FAFSA.
Generalized answer, yeah, it's just more, it's why we are for that so long. Because it's another issue of actually having, you still have a significant amount of people on your campus, we found out, that hasn't filled out FAFSA. They did fill out FAFSA, they could actually make a college. So we see a direct correlation between those that are filling out FAFSA, and those that have might go off to school. In this case, in the piece, obviously, you have more of a enumerated data set that would be beneficial to those who would fall in that first generation and in that first generation, and clearly, totally, in that low income.
And then, it still comes down to data limitation. Standardized cost institution if they're not at self-reported. I think probably the only other option we would have is to maybe go to free or reduced lunch status. Okay, but then that would be specific to each student. So
I think that they would be contaminated by the fact that the district has a certain percentage, then everyone's free. Yeah,
So that was one of the issues. Yeah. Last year's use of that method.
By including this metric, resources would be directed toward institutions that achieve success in supporting first-generation students, encouraging them to implement programs and initiatives tailored to this population. And then finally, it will help institutions to maintain enrollment despite projected declining numbers of high school graduates beginning in 2025. And it would help the state to achieve its 60/30 attainment goal. So in terms of the impact of first generation student bachelor's degree metric, again, that first column of numbers in the table is the actual performance distribution from the current year. And then you've got two first generation distributions at 3%, one with no sector weighting and one with a sector weighting. As you can see from looking at the numbers, again, allocating 3% of resources unweighted first generation bachelor's degrees shifts very little funding among institutions. If you look at that difference column in the center, and again, this is not a surprise because 1.5% of the weighting for the current current year distribution was first generation. 1.5% was allocated to first generation, and it was not weighted. When you apply the sector weights, 3.43 million shifts from the comprehensive institutions to the research institutions, and that would be approximately 86% of the $4 million that were given up by the research sector in 2024-25.
So, Bill, can I ask a question with this?
Sure.
So, as we discussed earlier, the metrics we use in the current model for this particular year we're in, 1.5% for low income, 5% for first gen. If we run that or look at that to see how that overlap, because obviously the first two are highly correlated with URM and everything else. I would think they would even be higher.
Yeah, it's essentially a 1-to-1 correlation because if I did 1.5% low income, 1.5% first generation with no weighting, it's what you see in that first column.
They're almost exact.
It is the 2024-25 distribution.
So
that one was easy for me to find.
So can we look at that one? Because obviously it's what we're doing today, and I would think that it would be higher by adding it back to.
So let me make sure I understand. Are you arguing that full 3% low income or something?
No.
I think he's arguing it should be 1.5% low income.
I'm saying we use the exact same thing that we have today. What does it look like?
Okay.
Because
for the next round.
Exactly, because that's where we are today, which would be the best comparison, I would think. From starting.
Yeah, the one thing that I would need to do is just run it with the sector weighting to do the comparison, but it would if there were no sector weighting, it would be the exact same numbers that you see in column one. And there would be no difference in those two center columns. It would be the exact same distribution.
Yeah, I'm just looking at, I know, go over Travis and over just a moment, but just the correlation seems to be very, very high on the first one. And low income first generation is not as high, but if you add them together, which we did this year, you're going to have an even higher correlation.
Yes, you would.
So you made a statement that certain height groups may have the highest. I'm not sure of that, but.
You know, I think what I hear you asking is if I can produce a table that looks just like this one, but in those two center columns, do the 1.5% low income, 1.5% first gen with no weight, and then compare it to this weight. Yeah.
That's a good starting point. That's where we are. The second thing. The second thing we're using, I just have a question in regard to restoring monies that have moved in the model. But isn't it correct that if you go back to the very first slide, of all the changes we made in the last General Assembly, moved money in the model intentionally, right? Every single one of them.
Yes.
Okay. And so I think if we're going to use that terminology, it would be very interesting to see what would those new metrics that are now in place in statute, what did that do? Because
I've already run that. I just don't have it included here.
Fair. That's fair. But if we're going to talk about restoring funding or moving funding, we just moved a whole bunch by statute. We moved more by statute than this one. Okay?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
So I don't think it's necessarily restoring. I think it's just a fact of the model.
Because moving funds around is what the model intended.
Exactly. And that's my point exactly. And so if you just pull out the adult piece as an example, funds were moved. I don't know how much, but I know funds were moved. I just don't remember. We looked at it.
We had new metrics, their weight metrics.
Exactly. So I'm responding to.
All right, Jess, what?
I'm restarting this, speaking of restoring and not restoring.
Okay, the next potential metric is underprepared student bachelor's degrees. It's the total number of bachelor's degrees, of course, awarded to underprepared college students during the academic year. Underprepared is defined as a bachelor's degree graduate that was deemed underprepared in either English or math based on CPE readiness policy thresholds. In terms of the rationale for this metric, one rationale is that the university model does not contain a metric that rewards enrollment progression for completion of underprepared students. It would provide a financial incentive for institutions to enroll and support underprepared students, providing increased access for this underserved group. It would help Kentucky to be able to attain its 60 by 30 attainment goal. And then lastly, it would help the institution to maintain enrollment despite projections indicating declining numbers of high school graduates beginning in 2025, also known as the demographic cliff.
Bill, could you go back to that definition? Excuse me.
Travis, let me ask here. So the CPS readiness policy threshold would mean that that would be a student who would be required to show a co-requisite for a set of four-year institutions, right?
Eli, did you need for him to go?
So to that point that was just made. That CPE readiness policy threshold, that remedial moment happens in the freshman year.
That's mainly. Yes,
So this measure would be a student taking a remediation class triggers that student to be an underprepared student. And then we measure them at graduation to say, were you in the underprepared category or were you not? Is that correct?
Yes.
which is, by the way, as I argued, a possible limitation for the center. Because to some degree, this is counting how well you're retaining those underprepared students, right? How well you're keeping them to move on toward graduation. Now, I'm not saying it's bad, I'm just saying that is possibly one of the items that you'd like to take a look at, because we went through a co-requisite model where you don't offer remedial courses anymore, you give them wraparound services that have to be successful.
Not to belabor the point, from a policy standpoint, this is an interesting argument, because this incentivizes you to enroll students that are underprepared, but it also motivates you to make sure they get to graduation, because you lose twice if you don't.
Correct, the reason why we wanted to look at this, you just saying.
Yeah, by focusing on bachelor's degrees produced for that population instead of enrollment for that population of progression, you're saying, did you get that student to the endpoint? And just as an aside, KCTCS for at least 6 years in their funding model has had an underprepared metric. Brendan, did you do away with it or do you still have it?
We still have it.
In 2024, you kept it. Okay.
Bill, how is the, says deemed underprepared in English or math? Sharing with everyone about that.
I'm gonna rely on my data expert here to respond to that question.
No worries. So basically that determination is made based on what we collect. We collect a collection called exam file. And basically what that is, when a student is the first time student entering the institution, it had all of their standardized scores, all their institution placement scores, basically all of their exams when they enter the institution. And based on that, the readiness policy has thresholds based on certain standardized tests, both in math and reading. And then based on that, a readiness determination is made on whether that student is underprepared in that area or not. And recently GPA was added to that, where institutions can also optionally use GPA to deem a student ready for college, just above 3.5.
So has every institution used the exact same?
Yes,
determination?
Yeah.
it's a statewide policy. Now, all of you guys come together with CBE to confirm those cutoff points for places.
Would transfer students not be included in this?
No.
So they would not be, so it would exclude transfer students in terms of the pool.
Have adult learners.
How did the test option period, COVID, and that affect this data?
Well, and that's a very good point. And the readiness policy, it doesn't change a lot, but those thresholds do change over time based on empirical evidence. We'll look to see first year student success, based on certain threshold scores, and we determine whether that threshold score is still predictive or not.
Let me add one thing, here, so we don't get them too mixed up.
Yeah.
Test optional net admissions.
Yeah.
This looks at placement. So the idea that even during the test optional phase that most of you still are in, they still give them placement tests to find out where they fit in this, even during the time of COVID. So this should not change tremendously at all, as a matter of fact.
And during that policy period, we did allow institutions to self-identify within each area, whether a student was ready or not. But
Which would be the biggest factor.
Exactly.
How about using conditional admissions status? Flag, because those are the programs that we end up wrapping around services
Yeah.
to ensure success.
we don't have any data. So you're going to hear me say that a lot today, but it's really a data limitation. We don't.
I just got a little confused between what I thought I heard that we were taking testing coming from basically high school. But then Aaron said it was placement exams once they came in. Which is it?
It's standardized tests. So
So it's
ACT.
not placement on entry.
Well, we're probably getting probably too deep in the weeds. We still do the junior test ACT. So a lot of, when you're entering the student in admissions, test optional, what you were saying is just not looking at the GPA coming in. But if the ACT has identified you being in need, that's where most of you go with. But you still do a placement test, no matter what class you go into. And at that time of placement test, many will fall outside of the, they will say, oh, I'll just place higher. So you don't go into.
Okay, so if they take placement and it pulls them out of the pool, that's right.
Which happens a lot. So in the end, what you're counting, going back to something you did in the earlier statement, a lot of times in the end, after they take the placement test and get placed in whatever class they get placed in, with that co-requisite model in place. So a lot of these data you're looking at, after they take that.
They are a year back.
That compulsory ACT is junior year.
I believe
Yes.
so. Yeah.
We just have to include transfer students. This calculation, you're calculating degrees at the end. So
Well, we basically we start. So our starting cohort are degree. So we start with the full cohort of baccalaureate degree. And then, so technically it could include transfer students because then what we do is we go back all the way to 2010-11 to see if we can find a first time exam file for you. To see if we can say, you know, are you or aren't you? Were you prepared when you were a first time college student? And if we can identify you in those data, then doing
transfer.
Going through the rest of these really quick.
Yes, sir. This next scenario, again, the first column of numbers is the actual 2024-25 distribution. And then you can see two scenarios for underprepared bachelor's degrees at a 3% allocation, one without sector weighting and one with sector weighting. And as you can see in that second column, allocating 3% of unweighted underprepared degrees shifts funding from Eastern, UK, and Moorhead to Western, NKU, and U of L. And President McFadden, we've reached out to Brian Green at your institution. Eastern's numbers seem to be proportionately lower than what we would expect for an institution of your size. And we don't know if it's a data collection issue or if you're just not enrolling or not graduating as many underprepared students as the other institutions. But that's why you see such a large minus 1.8 million in that difference column. When there's
got to be some data issues.
Well, when I saw this, as you can imagine what I said, right?
So anyway, we're going to look into that and try to tease that out. When you do apply the sector weights to the underprepared student degrees, it shifts 3.5 million from the comprehensive sector to the research sector. Again, that would restore about 87% of the $4 million given up by the research sector in 2024-25. And then our last potential metric is high school student bachelor's degrees. That's the total number of bachelor's degrees awarded to undergraduate students previously enrolled in high school following below state averages on proposed success metrics, otherwise known as high need. Metrics used to determine high school selection include high school graduation rates, college going rates, ACT scores, and the proportion of students enrolled qualify for the free and reduced lunch program. Degree counts recognize a baccalaureate degree earned at the institution of first enrollment. And one interesting thing, correct me if I'm wrong, Travis, because I just thought, realized this and may have spoke with you about it. Here, we're looking at only in-state bachelor's degrees for this, because we're looking at in-state public high school, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the in-state bachelor's degrees only that we're considering for this method. In terms of rationale, it would provide an incentive for institutions to recruit and enroll students from high schools and regions that may have historically been underserved. And it does provide significant overlap with low-income URM and first-generation student populations that attend schools in either economically distressed urban or rural areas. Any questions before we move on? Hearing none. Here is our fourth and last scenario. Again, the first column of numbers is the actual 2024-25 distribution. We have allocated 3% of our resources to high-need high school bachelor's degrees. And in the two middle columns in the table, there's no sector weighting. In the two columns to the far right, there is a sector weighting. As you can see by looking at the difference column in the very middle of the table, allocating 3% to unweighted high-need high school student bachelor's degree shifts funding from Northern, Murray, U of L, and UK to Eastern, Moorhead, and WKU. When the sector weightings are applied, 3.55 million shifts from the comprehensive sector to the research sector, which would restore 87% of the funds given up in 2024-25 by the research sector. Again, institutions, Moorhead and Murray have proposed two additional metrics for our consideration. Travis Muncie and I will be working with the folks at Moorhead tomorrow to try to see if we can construct a metric that I guess gets at what they would like to see in terms of that metric. I think adding dual credit hours to dual credit hours to the credit hour return metric is self-explanatory, but President Jackson, do you want to say anything about that particular metric?
The only thing I would add is this model was first created, obviously, dual credit was not as important as it is today. It's a major public policy item, which in some ways relates to enhancing dual credit or dual credit in every respect. You know, those are credit hours out here and students out here that we don't count anywhere in the model, not rewarded or otherwise for those types of students. So I think it would be interesting to look at. I'm not sure what that means for all of us. But, it's something we should take a close look at.
And essentially, I'm assuming it would be similar to the way that we earn the new adult learner metric to the earned credit hour component for the current. We would just calculate the number of dual credit hours by institution and add that into the earned credit hour component, and we could run a scenario and have it ready by our next meeting and show what the impact would be.
Thanks.
So you're only measuring how many credits you provide to the bank. It does nothing about the student success. Right, it's just the volume. That would be.
Yeah, so
That's the only thing you probably do in this case is measure.
Right, so it seems to me most of these metrics were around to try optimal outcome. That is degree. But this one, you could offer that someone could go to another university, right? Complete. So this one's detached from the degree.
I don't think this would be a specific metric in and of itself. Right now, it's explicitly excluded. So when we run the overall earned credit hours, we explicitly exclude dual credit students from that data set. So basically, this would just restore that and allow dual credit student earned credit hours to be included in the overall credit hours.
Wherever they receive.
Yes, yeah. Wherever those credit hours are.
And Bob, share more about the median family income metric you're proposing.
Best way out of that.
What are Moorhead State's interest levels expressed a thing, Thompson is, when you look at total public funds, which include state, federal, and bandwidth. Our interest level is Kentucky on the same playing field related to all public funds available for education. One of the things we approach in South recently, looking at certain regions in Kentucky that have exponential lower income and inability to pay. And we just started this conversation. I think the meeting maybe tomorrow or the next day.
It's tomorrow, and I've seen similar metrics in other states that are trying to get at exactly what you and Mary Fisher have proposed. So we'll take a look at that and report on that.
It becomes a regional metric, just to let you know, and that it doesn't replace the low income, even though there will be a lot of triangulated bulk incomes, right? But it is looking regionally at, would like to rephrase
Areas of poverty.
as an example, how all of the outputs, but it would be a reasonable.
Meaning that each person would have. What would you say that?
I said, which speaks, I think, to institution.
So. You recruit from across the state. Is there a regional metric for you?
I think that is a $10 question that we'll have to look at once we get the definition down. Because what happens with several grants or land grants, which is an example, that has the mission to cross all over the state, right? Conserve. Those all become probably a piece that we badly buy.
I could ask you to slip back just very briefly through the last slide you had for each of the four. You put up a percentage weighted, restore 87% on that. Go back to the next one. Underprepared restores 87%. What did the other two restore percentage wise?
The first one was, I want to say 99%.
Yes.
That one right there.
82 and 86.
86 on first gen.
And then 92.
And B2.
Oh,
And then 99 for low income.
Bill, what does that tell me about? What does that tell me? And at the start, I think you said 92% shift overall in funding due to OA. What did these four numbers, 99, 86, 87, 87?
It tells you that, you know, in 2024-25, because of the lack of weighting between the sectors, from the two metrics, low income and first generation, not as a result of improved performance, not as a result of changing the metric, but merely as a result of doing away with that weighting. You shifted a little over $4 million from the research sector to the comprehensive sector. If you re-implement the weightings for this next iteration of the performance funding model, you know, depending on which metric you end up choosing, it might not even be one of these four. If you add that weighting back in, it's very likely going to shift money back to the research sector and restore it more to what it would be, you know, based on true performance.
Separate from the weighting conversation, though, is it safe to say that low income almost has no impact? Right, 99%.
Yeah.
First gen would have the highest impact by a small bit at 86%. Is my logic solid?
Yeah, even though both are at the low impact level, right?
Right.
But it's the highest of the low impact.
That's right. Okay.
Could I return to Jay's proposed median income? I think, to Eli's point, I appreciate the conceptualizing of it as a regional metric, but you could also say number of students below median household and add that in as a total number, which would probably be fair across
Yeah, you can do that, that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
We even have, we looked at that. You can take the median or the mean.
I would caution in a couple areas from a data perspective. One is the lowest level of granularity that we can get to is county. Which works fine in Eastern Kentucky, but when you get to Fayette and Jefferson, there's a lot of variance there that isn't within that.
Only by example, your institution probably serves a lot of South Central students who would fall probably in this area.
And you've heard
Well,
that, babies too, right?
And-
So if you look at Louisville,
That's what I would say.
you know, I mean, you have the huge impact that Louisville there in the 4th Street area, I call it, right? I mean, that area has a significant need, I'll just say. So it gets really interesting how we regularly look at that.
And we also got to be aware of the new fast rules on using income. So I think there's still, a little bit of kind of ambiguity out there, but it looks like that we're no longer going to be able to use income data provided in the past that came from the IRS tool in any analysis that's not specifically for providing aid to an individual. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there.
Help me understand how the median income is different from the low income category.
Well, it just depends on what threshold you set.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically, using, they're both gonna be proxies. It just depends on where you set that. So, nationally, Pell recipient is usually that low income proxy at the post-secondary level. But, you can always set, as long as you have that income data, you could always set just kind of wherever.
The majority being, for example, 200% of Pell or something else, so it's the work.
You would definitely have to operationalize it.
Yeah, we would need to operationalize that.
So related to your question, there is a marginal difference between the student who is just being low income. Check the box, I'm awarded some type of FAFSA dollar versus abject poverty.
Right.
But there's a clear difference. And there are some areas of Kentucky where you find essentially low income, yes, but abject poverty is way below low income threshold. So therefore, when you look at ability to pay, plus all sources of state and federal dollars, still may not equal students. We're going to get essentially insurers to.
We got some decisions, like I know we have JCPCS students, but it's kind of probably a little longer than we did. But I'm okay to say as long as I want to. Bob,
Just one last question regarding the scenario. So from a correlation standpoint, just want to make sure we all interpret this correctly. Low income is the highest of the ones we run today. Low income has the highest correlation.
But you are in, that's correct.
What's that correlation percent?
68.
Yeah.
Just put my.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so for low income, looking at URM's backloaded earners, that low income captured 61.1%.
60.
What do the others capture?
So first gen captures 30%. Unprepared captures 22%. And the high school, which is a little different, captures around 62%. So we're looking at a more restricted population with the high school population, since we're basically only looking at in-state URM baccalaureate degree earners and those that went to public Kentucky high school. So that population is.
That's right. If you throw out of state in, that would probably capture one.
Yeah.
Which of those other categories include out of state of those low income, first gen, underprepared? Because I heard you say high school is not.
All
All of them?
except for that one, right?
Yeah.
There's no other Kentucky specific metric.
Yeah. So basically the high school would be primary in-state specific metric.
Is there any openness to considering it not being?
I just wanted to have a ground and show people what it is, these are the discussions we need to have, I mean, only thing I can think of is a data limitation, I'm looking at you.
You do exactly as I say now.
We have the cost of this next student clearinghouse and all that stuff.
If we could find a data source where we could, basically, we looked at 4 different metrics, high school metrics. We looked at the college going rate at the high school. We looked at the free reduced lunch proportion at the high school. We looked at the graduation rate for those that matriculated over time, the historical graduation rate. And then I knew of. But basically what we did, and the ACT, the mean ACT, and basically what we did is create a district to where we looked at we created a mean. And so anything so if your high school fell below the mean in those areas, then it's also weighted. So if you fell below the mean in 1, that weight was 0.25. If you fell below the mean in 2, that's 0.50, and then 0.75, and then 1. If like basically the high school was below the mean in all categories. So that's how we define the high.
But if it's a risky thing, to the school, because 1, those things can change quickly. 2, there are high performing students and low performing schools. And that's I just think that if we're going to focus on the student, let's focus on the student. I don't think focus on the schools.
Yeah. But then I guess, I mean, you could also make the argument that if a student is high performing in a school with much less resources, that, is historically low. But I completely agree that does mask, just like we talked about the county. That masks some of the variance.
And all of these have some limitations, right? For those of y'all who are in quantitative research, all of these areas have some limitations. Some have less than others, but they all have some limitations.
If you started using these, what's the consideration for privacy?
Well, that is a limitation. So basically, it's all about what data we have available. With our partnership with KY Stats, they do receive KV data. So we do have those data to create those means.
We have that.
Yeah.
Well, President Thompson alluded to in his opening remarks, there's only 2 basic questions this group needs to answer, and actually I'm turning into 3 questions. How should the 2024 working group define the term underrepresented student? Saying it in another way, what metric should be used to replace the URM student metric, bachelor's degree metric in the university funding model? And then lastly, should the replacement metric be weighted to account for cost and mission differences between sectors, or should there be no weighting?
And what we want to get to today before we go into KCPCS, or maybe even after we get through KCPCS, is to say, are there any we need to take off? What should be added on? We won't come back next time and do that, but we are looking forward to some decision making stuff, right? So if there are things that you all are saying, well, I don't want to go that way, let's take it off.
Well, and if there are any other metrics that any institution wants to propose, reach out to President Thompson, me, or Travis Muncie, send us an email and say, hey, what about this metric? Can we get the data for it? What would it look like? Be happy to run as many scenarios as I can get my hand.
And you'll probably say it's a great idea, and I'll say data limitation.
What's the time frame for those suggestions?
We're coming back October 2nd, so
First Wednesday.
tomorrow, no, in the next week or so to give us time to, because these guys have to do a lot of work for each one of these. These are not just easy to touch a button. They fall in your lap. So if there are things that that you want to look at, I would ask you to go back and deliberate and quickly, because even though Bill loves to do this stuff, even if he stays up all night, I'm gonna give you all a chance to think about that, but I'm gonna let KCPCS do their thing first. That's okay. And then we'll come back.
Good afternoon. My name is Brendan Lehagan. I'm the Director of Budget and Financial Planning at KCTCS. This is Katie Carn. She's a representative from IR. We'll try to be quick. Bill has covered a lot of the things as far as legislative language and what we're looking to do with the underrepresented student metric going forward. Little agenda items here. We have URM metric has been removed for 24-25. Looking at replacement metrics for the underrepresented student metric. Then look at change recommendations. We worked with our president's leadership team and college presidents, all our other stakeholders within the KCTCS to look at potential metrics for this underrepresented student metric. Went over the first generation college student credentials, students with dependents credentials, and ID high school credentials. KCTCS within our model, we use the credential metric rather than the degree metric, which incorporates any of our diplomas, degrees, anything else that on those short-term credentials. Bill covered a lot of this in his presentation on the changes for 24-25 and the 11th hour, defining underrepresented students as first generation college students for the current year, distributing 1% of allocable resources to degree production for KCTCS and 5% of allocable resources to low income students. Moving the 2% we previously had allocated for URM credentials. One little caveat to that was with all the changes we were making in 24-25, we were in the process of moving all those credential metrics, all those student success metrics from 2% to 4%. So we actually had earmarked URM credentials for 4%, low income for 4%. So in the last shuffling around of the percentages, it only accounted for 6% of the 8% allocated to URM and low income credentials. So we moved an additional 2% of allocable resources to our non-traditional age 25 plus credential metric. This is just a little background information on the adjustments for the current year and what we are proposing for next year. So this is we moved in 23-24. I'm sorry, in 23-24 we had underrepresented minority at 2%. Our recommendation was to move that credential metric to 4%. With that being struck, we moved 1% from the underrepresented minority to low income and the non-traditional, or I'm sorry, underrepresented degree metric. So that we put that additional 2% into the non-traditional age. All the other metrics stay the same. We move transfers from 2 to 4%, and we change our equity allocation to be distributed based on needs and needs. Just a little overview of our proposed, our current metrics. In the language in the Senate bill, and it does use language of degrees for that underrepresented student metric. First generation student degrees. Our hope is to line that up with our other potential metrics and include all our credentials in that metric. This right here is just kind of an overview of our current and what we're proposed to see the changes. Everything stays the same on our credentials tied to the economy, progression, transfers. A little shift in the percentages to line up with the 4% on our student success metrics. And what we're looking to do is define that underrepresented student metric. And again, those three that we're looking at are the first generation credentials, students with dependents credentials, and ID high school credentials. And below there, you see a little bit of changes.
Let me ask you this, are you thinking about using those three as the definition or one
I think what we're trying to use one of the three, and I think from discussions with the presidents and our IR folks, it's kind of gone in that list that it's listed at first generation credentials and students with dependents in high schools. And just talking about some of the opportunities and with the data and our student population, which I'll get into. This is a little overview of our fall enrollment and in comparison to the four-year institutions. And see, we have a high population of first generation students, underprepared, low income, part-time students, adult student population. Those with the check mark you see beside it, underprepared, low income, and its adult credentials are currently built into the model. The first generation and the dependents are ones that are under consideration. And again, the URM is around 20%. Right? So that would be a lot of overlap from that URM would go to the first generation students. These are just definitions. They follow a lot, but I think the way we are pulling the data is the same as university model. First generation college students, students with dependents does include students with children they support or other dependents. Based on any FAFSA data since 2005-06. I need high schools is pulled the same way that Travis and Still outlined. And again, these are all credential metrics that we're looking at for ACCCS.
That's like saying with the GED.
And the GED is included in the high school. High schools. Just a quick look at the move from URM and potential for the first generation credential metric. This is the credential metric. As you can see, we did credentials for average 3-year average credentials across the system. Through 2023 on the URMs was 5,300. First generation was over 16,000. And a little breakdown by college. We have the same thing with students with dependents credentials, 5,300, we're still over 11,000 running through 2023. And then we have the high school credentials, which you'll see is double the URM.
So it doesn't look like we have nearly as much crossover as was of 4-year students.
Yeah, I think it's just we added another population on top of it, so it's
Also, look at Jefferson Bluegrass, especially.
Yeah.
Where you would expect to find more of those, so you don't have a lot of correlation.
And there is not a lot of correlation between the colleges. You will see that. I have that right here, actually. So these are the winners and losers on moving from the URM to potential metrics. The first, what you see over here on your left is in the green are the people that gain through the move from URM to potentially first generation high school or parents or other dependents. And then on the right, you'll see the percentage point shift differential by college. As you see there in the red, Jefferson and Bluegrass, the larger cities are ones that lose the most. And it gets shifted out to some of the southern industry colleges. So in terms of what that means as the performance funding model calculation, when you run the model calculation, moving from the URM at 4% and shifting it to one of the three metrics proposed, it doesn't make a huge difference. The biggest ones you'll see is that negative 0.4 and 0.3% for Jefferson. Typically, that means we have $169 million running through the model. So about each 0.1% is about $169,000 as of allocable resources, but we are not at equilibrium, so depending on the size of the performance pool and what year we're getting to equilibrium, we have 6 colleges above equilibrium that have a whole harmless piece held into the model, so there's no funding removed from them. So the biggest ones again are Bluegrass and Jefferson. See some other colleges with military military bases also have some ships out. So those are the 3 metrics that we're looking at going forward. We have the same kind of decision points and next steps that the university on defining this underrepresented student metric for the KCTCS funding model. We do not have any sector weighting issues to discuss. We would like to align some of the percentages back to our 4% credential metric and make sure that the first generation language follows the credential metric rather than the degree reduction metric. And then we're currently having some discussions with PLT and leadership and Dr. Quarles funding models recommendations and be prepared for the October 1st with a recommendation from all KCTCS stakeholders.
This next step, so our 16 presidents will reconvene in the month. Present this, come back, and then also of note, making sure that we recognize credentials as well as degrees, on the technical side of the house. And I know that we've had talks with some legislators about some of the places that come in have to do with square footage, which is given that space optimization. Has to be counted for.
Let me ask you this, have you done the crosswalk with, those that are 25 and older? Not that we would use that as our adult market. So criteria, but have you done that with parents with dependents?
We had that.
So, you could actually do it in a second, there's not that much actually, but I can get you all those numbers.
Yeah, I'd be interested because I would, it seems like there would be a high correlation. Senator Gillens, do you any questions for KCTCS? As you all know, they have a little bit different of a distribution process. You know, they subsidize heavily their other campuses. Oh, is that you, Secretary Hicks?
Yes, I had one question for KCTCS. In the early portion of the slide deck, they showed low income as being defined as 0, basically to under 20,000. Is that a different metric than the Pell eligible that the 4 years use?
Slide deck, there was a president, there's a bullet regarding low income and definition up to, I want to say 150,000.
Yeah, he added 20,000. There's no. There's.
Slide with the bar chart.
Bar chart.
Bar chart. Which one?
No.
Slide 12.
Bar chart. Go back on.
The one that was comparing to the
Oh,
full.
Yeah.
And that was the data CPE uses.
I think his question is, how does that line up with eligible students? I mean, how does that from 0 to 1999, is that a crosswalk with eligibility?
So we have, so our, and is it different? So we do the co-recipients for the low income off of the type A file list. So if you want us to dig into that, we can certainly provide that.
Yeah, I think that was your question, right, Mr. Secretary?
Yeah, I did not hear her answer. Is it yes or no?
She doesn't know fully, she's gonna crosswalk and get back with us. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you. Okay, guys, I know we're out of time, but any decisions once you want to make? Before we go. Any that you want to take off that we showed you today? You want to leave them all up for vote next time? Is that what I'm hearing? I'm looking at you, Ken, because you're the only one checking your head.
No, the only thing. From my perspective, I just need, I'm gonna probably ask Bill Travis, just more understanding of the transfer issue when it comes to the unprepared student to be able to understand that a little bit more. You know, 25 to, we want to push the transfers more, it's a goal of ours. So to have any of the metrics kind of lean against that is something I just want to.
Be okay. Possible.
We're gonna put it on ticket for vote. How many you want to eliminate the high school effort? Anybody not?
I'm not voting. As a principal, I want to keep it all.
Yeah.
I tell you.
Well, I'll tell you what, we should keep it all on the table. I'm okay with that. But I would ask that we be prepared next time to knock a few of them off the table, because we almost have to. Are there any, I mean, I would also ask you to seriously send to us anything you won't run. So we can actually do that. So next time we'll probably go through fewer presentations and get down to submitting gritty on some voting, right? With the hope that we'll come close to our final answer. Are there any questions, Chair Tiffin or Secretary Hicks? I'll ask you all first, since you're on the screen, that you want to bring to this group now.
President Thompson, no, I appreciate all the conversation, discussion today. And one question I have, will you send all these slides out that were presented today to us so we have them for review?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
And we'll also do the others that we've been asked for Murray and Moorhead, and we'll give you those too. Secretary Hicks, anything from you, sir?
No, a lot to chew on. Appreciate the hard work behind the information.
What about the folks around the table? Anything to bring to the table?
Just appreciate all the work.
Well, I appreciate you all. It's the reason why. You all have questions. Hopefully we can get all the answers to the questions that you had. But, you know, I do want to say, Bill and the data team, they work really hard to make sure that all these things are as pure as they can be. So, appreciate that. Anything else for the good of your order? Sure.